invitation to present at the RSNA this year virtually. My talk is going to center around predictions and whether they are useful. I do not have any relevant disclosures for this particular talk. George Orwell said, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Many think he was talking about totalitarian governments, but actually he may well have been alluding to data scientists. How so? In this world of predictions, what we're doing and what data science does, which takes from many other elements of statistics, is that we use past information and use that to generate the likelihood of future events. We can do that either in individuals or in populations. Now, I'm going to use the term prediction, which is the assessing the probability of a future event, interchangeably with prognosis, which essentially is the same thing. The prognosis of a cancer is its 5-year survival. Prognosis of a cardiovascular condition is the time to mortality, time to death, time to heart failure. An event is what we're predicting, and though that's usually death, it can also be disability, development of a disease, or something as simple as a readmission within 30 days. I take the term prediction engines as plagiarized from a book I highly recommend, The Simple Economics of Artificial Intelligence, which posits, amongst many things, that the major use of AI, or rather its major currency, is going to come from the fact that it's going to make predictions, and lots of them, and make them cheaply. I like the premise, but I'm not sure I share the author's optimism, or at least I don't transport it to healthcare. So fundamentally, why wouldn't you want to know about the future? I think we've been trying to know about the future for centuries. The Greeks approached the oracle of Delphi, who would caution them from fighting or make predictions about the fate of their empire. King Belshazzar had writing on the wall, and Macbeth was famously told, "Hail to thee, thou shalt be king hereafter." But there's a big difference. The big difference was what those prophecies said. They said with certainty. There was no probabilistic element to it. Imagine if the third witch had said to Macbeth, "You have a 20 to 80% chance of becoming king thereafter." I don't think his wife would have taken the prophecy that seriously. But now when we deal with predictions, we actually have a number associated with it, a probability. And that probability gives you a certain chance of something happening. In economic parlance, I have to make a distinction here between risk and uncertainty. Risk is what we think about in terms of having a numerator that we know about and a denominator we know about, like a 10% chance of a mortality, a 5% 5-year survival, etc. Uncertainty is when we don't know the numerator or denominator. For example, an example of uncertainty would be the long-term effects of COVID-19 on the heart. We kind of know that there may be some, but we have no idea what the numerator and denominator is. And at the time of recording, though there is quite a bit of chances that Biden's going to win the election, there's a lot of uncertainty that those polls are correct. So uncertainty is both a function of not knowing what the numerator and denominator is, and also the fact that we can be anxious about the future. Predictions are on the rise. The top graph shows an exponential rise of the search term prediction when you put it into Medline, and it's rising even more. That's one trend. The other trend is predictions are becoming cheaper, just as those economists predicted that they would. And in fact, in this particular case, the cost per genome, it's actually getting cheaper, or it diverts from Moore's law, which is a power law itself. So it's more than just a power law in terms of the rate at which the price is dropping. Why is that? Well, there's data everywhere. There are lots of variables, improved statistical methods, and without sounding too facetious, there are lots of assistant professors who have work to do and who need to publish. And so with all this data around, we are exploding with these prophecies, probabilistic prophecies that would really, I don't think the oracles of Delphi would be able to keep up with the amount of predictions that are coming. And now, with deep learning, which is essentially a computational powerhouse on steroids, all of this is going to be augmented even further. Just to give you an example, this is just a montage that I casually collected of stuff that we're predicting. Doctors test tools to predict your odds of a disease. Well, how great is that? We've gone from subjectivity to objectivity. There's predictions, and there are predictions. So there's a deep learning score that gives you a standard mammographic density for breast cancer risk prediction. We are training algorithms to predict when the patient will die. And imagine that. Imagine saying to a patient, you're going to die in 30 days, and here they are on the 35th day. They've proven you wrong. That's like, that movie, Final Destination. You're like, hey, middle finger to the prediction model. But that's the thing. That's what we're desperate to know. We're desperate to know about the future. And we have all these tools that can actually give us prophecies of the future. There's a deep learning that predicts the need for a total knee replacement. Above and beyond, I presume, what the orthopod thinks. There's a deep learning tool, lo and behold, that tells you whether a patient is at risk of having a pulmonary embolism. You can imagine how that's going to be used in the emergency department. When it's positive, they go for a PE study, and when this particular algorithm is negative, they say, well, it could be a false negative, and they'll still go for a PE study. But suffice to say, there are lots and lots of predictions, and this trend is not going to abate. Prediction is essentially information, and it should be treated as information. Information is meaningful when it's more than random, and you can all recall from the area under the ROC curve. And prediction is judged in the same way in the C-statistic. And I'm not going to get into that too much, because that's complex statistics. But what I'm going to get into is something a little bit more primal. Are predictions useful? And the answer is, well, I guess it depends. Isn't it just useful to know for the sake of knowing? And I would say, well, yes and no. In terms of actually decision making, prediction would be useful when knowing what you know by means of the prediction changes the management and improves the outcome. In the world outside of healthcare, prediction models are used quite often. For example, Walmart was looking at what things were actually their customers were buying during impending hurricane, and they sieved data. They used big data and AI sieved data, and they found that of the things that you would expect people to buy, like flashlights and water, yeah, sure. But they found a couple of surprising things. They found that people tend to buy strawberry Pop-Tarts and beer. I can understand the beer, but strawberry Pop-Tarts is a bit counterintuitive, actually. But they're using that. And then what did Walmart do? They stocked their stores with strawberry Pop-Tarts and beer. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You see the beer stocked, and now you buy it because you want it, but also because it's there. Predictions are used in the credit card fraud detection, in anticipatory shopping, in the ads. And it's used with a lot of bias, unfortunately, in the criminal justice system. But what about healthcare? The model for that is the model that I use, would say, is in calcium scoring. And that has added value of prognostic information. Calcium score gives you a risk of future cardiovascular event, but it's a risk above and beyond the Framingham typical risk score, which comes from blood pressure, family history, and so on and so forth. And what is key with the calcium score, why it's useful, it reclassifies risk. So if you're at high risk and you have no calcium, you become low risk. And if you're at low risk and you have calcium, you become high risk. So it's reclassification. So not only does it reclassify, it de-risks, so the high risk becomes the low risk, but it changes management. It puts people you didn't think needed statins on statins, and it puts people that you thought needed statins out of statins. So it's bidirectional. And this is the model that should be used. But prediction has limitations. I don't think everything is as clear-cut as the calcium scoring model. There is what I call a therapeutic ceiling. There's only so much you can do. If you find out, for instance, that somebody has a certain risk of developing heart failure, 10%. What are you going to do differently? They're already on medication, fully optimized. Are you going to test the dose, increase the dose? There's also a limited value of uncertainty reduction. So, for example, if you have a very broad bandwidth of probabilities, like 10 to 90% of P, and then you say, right, I've got it down to 15%, or I've got it down to 15.1%. What's that extra 0.1% going to do? Is it going to change your management? You're going to say, oh, damn, it's 15.1, not 15%, and therefore I must get a CTP study. That's not really how we think. We don't think in these quantitative ways. The third problem is surrogates. Surrogates are proxies of diseases. They wouldn't be called surrogates if they weren't. So they are highly probabilistically associated with the disease, but they're not necessary and they're neither sufficient. And meeting the threshold of disease obviously doesn't mean you have disease. You can tell by the threshold of which we call acute renal failure, or renal failure from contrast-induced nephropathy, a little bump in creatinine. That's so common that even people who don't have contrast have it. So that means you can get overdiagnosis and overtreatment. So if you're having a prediction model that simply finds surrogates like osteopenia or even osteoporosis, sure, some of them it's great to find and you can treat them with bisphosphonates and you'll prevent that insufficiency fracture. But in some, you'll have overtreated them and caused jaw necrosis. So it's like, it's a trade-off. And then the question is, how do we know that predictions even improve outcomes? Well, we can do an RCT, which is the gold standard way, but can you imagine doing RCTs for every little variation in prediction? You can do statistical models, but they have problems as well. So, it's far from clear. And the key thing is that you have to have added value. Now, for example, if you find that breast arterial calcification is a potential surrogate marker for cardiovascular disease, that's fantastic. That's very clever, very good. But that's only useful if you say, well, that is above and beyond what we already know, above and beyond the patient's cholesterol or family history or high blood pressure, or if it supersedes all of that, or if it's not there. So it's complex. And so it's far from clear that it adds value, and it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, just like with Macbeth. You tell somebody that here we have a prediction model that will tell you if you're at high or low risk of renal failure, and then what are they going to do? They're going to use that particular prediction model. Doctors are going to, and there's going to be an app for it, and then you've got to use the app, and then people are going to be using it all the time, and then people who didn't, patients who weren't at risk of renal failure, will become at risk of renal failure merely by use. And this is kind of like an overdiagnosis issue. So we have to think about predictions in both ways, in terms of how it will change the patient management, how will it change us. And as predictions become cheaper, more will be used. And at that point, you have this too much information issue where we have to use our value of judgment. We have to say, okay, I know this bit of information is great, but given the circumstances, I think it's probably not that useful. Predictions, of course, can be useful at extremes. An example is genome-wide polygenic scores. The middle bit of this Gaussian distribution isn't terribly informative, but the very high and the very low is. Like the calcium score, the very high you can say, okay, I think there's some stuff going on with you. The very low you can say, I think you can be reassured. So predictions can be quite useful at extremes of information. But I would say that with the massive increase in predictions that we're seeing with artificial intelligence companies, my advice to them would be to focus on what is happening to the patient right now. Tell us, does the patient have pneumonia? Does the patient have pulmonary edema? Where the lines and tubes are on the chest radiograph? Does the patient have perforation? That's what doctors want to know. Actionable information that changes management in 24 hours. Not stuff that's going to happen in 10 or 20 years. That's great. That's good for population health people sitting on their armchair, but for doctors in the trenches, they want to know what is happening now, not what's going to happen in 20 years from now. And so I put this rather intemperately on Twitter. My unsolicited and free advice to all AI vendors: diagnose and you shall be billionaires. Predict and you shall be in the cages of peer-reviewed journals, forever cited but never used. Or be giving wonderful talks at the RSNA. Thank you very much for listening.
Hello and welcome to this session titled Mergers, Acquisitions and Disappearances in AI. Saurabh Yar has very kindly asked me to come and speak a little bit on this topic. I know I've got 12 minutes, so we'll get straight into it. As you all know, there are a wide variety of AI startups in this space now. And last year at the physical conference at RSNA 2019, there were just around, I think, 100 or so startups. So we thought it might be interesting to try and see what the trends are, not in terms of the clinical aspects of these, but to look at sort of the market movements and to look at particularly what the M&A space, the mergers and acquisition space, looks like. So just a little bit of background, we can see that the amount of venture capital, that is money that's coming in from liquid asset investors, is actually increasing year on year. It reached 10.7 billion in 2019. That's been rising from 1.8 billion almost a decade ago. So investors are clearly predicting that healthcare technology is going to be a very powerful investment for the future. So that's why we have so many startups in this space. What's interesting to look at is the actual shareholder return. This is from a report from PwC from 2020, January till June. And you can see actually the only industry that really is showing a return on investment is health, closely followed by technology. So no surprise there. Again, it follows the recent trends of investment. But what this does mean is that with all this investment, it means there's a lot of money lying around, which means you can start a lot of companies. But of course, as we all know, not all companies can be successful in the same market. So what happens in a market which is saturated full of startups? Well, some merge, some get acquired, and some disappear. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So very quick bit of context here. What is a merger? There's different types of mergers, but in essence, it's when two startups come together to form a brand new company. They may maintain the same name of one or other of the companies when they merge, but in essence, you form a new company by combining the assets, the staff, the people, the technology, the customer base of both companies. This can be horizontal, which is depicted in this diagram, where you might just decide to do a merger with a direct competitor. It can be vertical, so a developer might merge with a supplier company to create a new company which covers both development and supply. You might have what's known as a congeneric merger, where two companies with very synergistic business streams might merge together, and that might help reduce overheads and costs and increase customer base in a specific area. Or you might have a slightly larger company merging with a slightly smaller company to do a market extension or product extension merger, whereby you subsume someone's customer base or their product into a new company. And then you can have what's known as conglomerations. These are slightly rarer, but in essence, you have businesses coming together which have no similarities. They're just trying to dominate wider niche verticals in different markets and just do it all under one umbrella company. Mergers, by and large, are always friendly. They can't really go ahead unless the C-level team of both companies actually agree to do so. So mergers are generally friendly. So in terms of mergers in the AI startup space for radiology companies, there was really only one merger in 2020 that happened in June, and that was between Cortex Labs and Healthlytics. Now, Cortex Labs has a suite of neuroimaging products, some of which are FDA cleared. And Healthlytics had a prostate engine, which was also FDA cleared and is also focusing on genetics. They had a friendly merger just based on sort of product extension, and they kept the name Cortex Labs. What's interesting about this really is that they were already sister companies. They shared some of the same staff and leadership. So, for instance, the CTO, I believe, of Healthlytics was also working at Cortex Labs at the same time. So they were already sister companies who knew each other very well. So this is a very friendly merger just to combine resources and to add a product extension to the line of Cortex Labs. So that was the only merger. There have been no other single incidences of two AI startups merging apart from this one. So we'll move on quickly to acquisitions. So an acquisition is different to a merger in that it's another company completely subsumes the other company, but maintains its own company control and branding. And the subsumed company may well actually maintain some level of independence. It's just a shareholder and director difference, really. These are usually friendly, but can be hostile. And when they're hostile, they're called takeovers. There's different reasons for doing these to mergers. You might just have a small product gap in your portfolio, so you buy a smaller company to fill that gap. You might want to benefit from economies of scale. You might want to be diversifying. There's a whole list there. Typically, a more successful startup will buy a less successful startup, or a mid-size enterprise, or indeed one of the major OEM vendors, GE, Siemens, Philips, Agfa, Fuji, may want to acquire a startup and just bring them into their portfolio. So there's lots of reasons why you might want to do this. I think what's interesting in the radiology AI space is that we're going to hopefully start to see some of these acquisitions happen, so people can get new niche offerings into their portfolio, and also a technology gain. So perhaps OEM vendors who haven't put the time and effort into developing AI technology yet may well acquire interesting startups if they can be acquired at the right price. So in Q4 2019, RadNet, which is one of the largest radiology service providers in America, acquired a company called Nulogix. And then again in Q1, they acquired Deep Health. So they acquired the whole team of both these companies, and that brought them up to being one of the largest radiology service providers in America with a decent AI portfolio. Nothing really happened since then for RadNet. Also in Q1, I think it was in March, Symphony AI announced that they were acquiring Terra Recon. So they were the people who brought us Envoy AI, the platform to deliver AI into hospitals with its own marketplace as well. So that was a big acquisition that was very well publicized back in Q1. But we all know what happened in Q2 of this year. Coronavirus hit. And since then, there's not been a single announcement of another acquisition in the radiology AI space. Now, I am recording this about a month and a half before RSNA. I'm aware that sometimes acquisitions and mergers might get announced just in the run-up to RSNA. So if another one has been announced post October 15th, then you have my apologies. I can't time travel and predict these things. So what about disappearances in this space? Well, we predict really that in any market which is saturated with startups, that some of those startups will just die off. It'll be survival of the fittest in the long run. So let's have a look and see who has disappeared. At the start of the year, in April, there were some rumors that coronavirus was going to adversely affect the staffing of health tech startups, and this was reported in Stat Plus in the health tech news column, especially around San Francisco. A lot of people were reporting layoffs, and at the time, Kurt Langlotz from Stanford also tweeted he was hearing about layoffs from startups. But let's have a look and see if this translated to anything in the radiology AI space. Well, the first one to note is a company called Deep Radiology, who many of you will know have been at RSNA at least for the past 3 years back to back. They've always had this same booth. They've hired some people external to their company to hold iPads and give out information. Well, it turns out they haven't become an industry sponsor of RSNA this year in 2020, and they don't seem to have updated their website in over 12 months. I couldn't find any other information or news on the internet about them since RSNA last year. And as the photo shows here, quite aptly, no signal being produced. So I'm counting Deep Radiology as one of the disappearances. There are some others. These are all startups who presented at RSNA back in 2017 when I first started watching this space. Galileo was a clinical decision support engine. Interestingly, it was powered by Bayesian reasoning. Now, I've always been skeptical that Bayesian reasoning alone is enough to make a good diagnostic decision support system. And in fact, to my knowledge, no one has actually deployed a Bayesian system anywhere in healthcare. Yet, I think they're very difficult to quality manage in a sense. And the predictions that they make are dependent very much on the amount of information you can put in on them. So I'm not too surprised to see a Bayesian predictive diagnostic engine disappearing off the scene. Another company that disappeared was called Health Level. Their tagline was Uncommon Insight. They in 2017 were announcing a radiology data analytics platform, but that doesn't seem to have materialized. Mindshare Medical was a lung nodule AI company. Again, no updates on their website for over 12 months. Lpixel was quite a large and flashy Japanese startup. They had purportedly AI for brain aneurysms and lung nodules. And following the thread, they actually submitted to the Japanese regulators to get regulatory approval, but I could find no documentation of an outcome of those submissions. So perhaps they were declined and perhaps they couldn't gain further funding. But really, it's just guesswork at this point. Another company, Quantitative Insights, announced that they'd received the first de novo application for a breast imaging AI deep learning software. Well, I looked on the FDA database and they have a letter called a reclassification order from the FDA, asking them to reclassify their software because it was in the wrong class. And then since then, the website has gone missing. Nothing on social media channels either. So I'm counting this one as a kill by the FDA. And lastly, a small company called Realize I, which had a CT lung digital detection package. I, again, couldn't find anything further in the news since mid-2019 on this company. So another disappearance. I think what's interesting to note is that we've only had one merger, 3 acquisitions and 6 disappearances, which really speaks to how early this market is. And there's a very interesting paper here published by Alan Alexander et al. Called An Intelligent Future for Medical Imaging, a market outlook on the space. And they've said that the current state really is just before Horizon 1, where we have fragmented startups with no clear leaders. And I think the research, the brief amount of research I've done to build this presentation would probably agree with that. I think probably we're heading into Horizon 2. There are some emerging winners. There are some platforms that can deliver at scale. There's definitely FDA approval of AI algorithms. So I think now we're moving beyond that current state into Horizon 2. I think when we get to Horizon 3, that's when we'll have a mature market, and that's when we'll see a lot more M&A activity and a lot more disappearances. So what conclusions can we draw? 6 disappearances is relatively low out of 100. I expect more, many more over 2020, especially if coronavirus continues to be an issue. Very minimal merger and acquisition activity for radiology AI. In fact, there was very minimal M&A activity worldwide, again, probably because of coronavirus. And I think really the conclusion that you can draw is that the market is too young and we don't know who the key players are. I think one salient point is that there is no clear winner in who has the right path to market. And in fact, there may not be a clear winner on this for a couple more years. But in essence, startups can choose to put their AI directly into hardware through the OEMs, directly into a PACS, or through a third party such as a marketplace, or they could partner with the teleradiology firms. I'm a big believer that the teleradiology one is a winner for those AI systems that are for non-urgent prioritization. I think human plus AI is better than just AI or human alone. And I think teleradiology services are best incentivized to provide AI-driven, efficient services with human in the loop. They also benefit from ingesting images from a wide variety of locations and modalities. So they have better training and ongoing validation data. That's just my gut instincts. But we will see. There definitely have been some deals this year with people partnering with OEM vendors, and certainly most of the AI startups are either directly integrated with PACS or in a marketplace. Still, it's early days. The rest of 2020, the rest of 2021 is still to come unless a global apocalypse happens. Otherwise, I will see you next year with an update.
Hi, I'm Dr. Stefan Borstelmann from sunny Florida, and I'm going to give you a very brief history of generative adversarial algorithms. I have nothing to disclose. You might ask, can I use GANs? To which I reply, yes, you can. If I've done my job well today, and you think GANs are your new favorite thing, say, can I get a witness? And I think my colleagues like GANs too. AI is great, but frankly, deep learning requires lots of images. Images that have been reviewed and labeled by a radiologist. Mining radiology reports to produce those labels is easier said than done, as we learned with the NIH chest X-ray data set. Presently, medical image data use requires radiologist review. That's time-consuming and expensive. Ian Goodfellow had the same problem with labeled data. He had certainly used image data augmentation hacks, flips, crops, zooms, and rotates. But these altered images weren't the real thing. How could you use the data you had to create additional useful data without labeling? So since this is a history lesson, let me give some history. Ian Goodfellow was out drinking with his doctoral student friends in Montreal one night, discussing how to generate new images from existing data. He wondered if you could make two neural networks fight each other to generate images in an unsupervised manner. When he got home, he coded all night and invented the GAN. To understand a GAN, start with an autoencoder. An autoencoder encodes input data, compressing it into a representation of the neural net's belief of the essence of that data, a deep belief network. That latent space construct is called a manifold. It is the probabilistic representation of input data. Latent space can be decoded and re-expanded to demonstrate the autoencoder's learning of the input. It can also be manipulated, the variational autoencoder. Most importantly, it does not require labeled data. It is unsupervised learning. So, what's a GAN? A GAN is two deep networks running side by side. A student network, the generator, and teacher network, the discriminator. The student generates fake data, and the teacher's job is to say if it's fake or not. The student starts guessing randomly, and by the teacher telling them yes or no, the student improves its subsequent guesses. The teacher also improves. The student is creating a space manifold designed to fool the teacher by being as close as possible to the teachers. The student algorithm finds equivalent novel solutions on the algorithm's manifold in high-dimensional space. Goodfellow's GAN, which was the first GAN, used a vanilla neural network of fully connected layers, was subject to producing the same images repeatedly, called mode collapse, and was unstable because its solution was a mathematical saddle point. But even though it only produced tiny images, it was a breakthrough. DCGAN in 2016 used convolutional neural networks, binary cross-entropy, batch norm, and ReLU activations to generate larger and clearer images. It becomes unstable over 128 by 128 pixels, however. Importantly, it demonstrated the possibility of vector arithmetic, where features could be added or removed in latent space. Man with glasses minus man without glasses plus woman without glasses equals woman with glasses. Controlling the GAN's output gives us the conditional GAN, or CGAN. These require labels, but for that you get better control of the generator. Their uses are chiefly artifact removal and denoising. Chi et al. Took high-resolution CT scans of cadavers with cochlear implants and used those to train a CGAN, then used the GAN on living patients' temporal bone scans to identify their cochlear electrodes. The GAN reduced artifact and allows for localization. 2017's CycleGAN is the style transfer GAN, the GAN that can make a horse look like a zebra or an MRI like a CT. This was very exciting at the time, but Cohen et al. And the original inventors were worried about hallucinations occurring with the style transfer. This was a valid concern arising from class imbalance issues. The possibility of such transformations should be understood in the context of the immense amount of carefully engineered, bias-free data and rigorous testing and tweaking necessary for this to be reliable for clinical use. The next three are from Tero Karas at NVIDIA Research: Progressive GAN, or StyleGAN version 0, StyleGAN 1, and StyleGAN 2. Progressive and StyleGAN 1 grow the image from a small kernel all the way to 1024 by 1024 pixels. The problem is that it also grows artifacts: the water droplet artifact, the phase artifact, and background artifacts. I've noted artifacts with red arrows in the images above. StyleGAN 2 removes many of these artifacts by mapping latent space into a smoothed second latent space, which is truncated and modified by an adaptive instance normalization. It drops the progressive architecture for a ResNet, and there are many, many other tweaks. Bottom line, it's better. Raising the question, if StyleGAN 2 is so good with faces, how will it do with chest x-rays? In preparation for this lecture, I trained the StyleGAN 2 on 1,000 normal chest x-rays taken from the NIH chest x-ray dataset. I used transfer learning from the trained face weights. I chose to create normal chest x-rays so that abnormalities created by the GAN would be most apparent. And this is what I got. So it appears we can use StyleGAN 2 to produce fairly realistic looking chest x-rays. Let's dissect this a bit. Epoch 28 shows discontinuous ribs in the lower left image and hints of the sclerae at the left hilum in the upper middle image. Note that the eye in the top left image has been transformed into a bronchus. By epoch 65, the thoraces look reasonable. However, most of them lack the humeral heads, best exemplified in the upper right image. Epoch 165 varies around grayscale, which is why the image turns violet. The algorithm has gone into nonsense in the upper left. By epoch 231, we see improved variation in the chest X-ray, in size, penetration, and sex, of which one would be hard-pressed to find fault with, except for the high density in the top left image, which we know is a residual of the algorithmic degradation, but could easily be mistaken for scarring or aspirated barium. While image quality can be quite good at 1024 by 1024 resolution, peripheral fidelity waited until later epochs. There was convergence and divergence of the output over epochs. Basic metrics for GAN evaluation begin with precision and recall, or PPV and sensitivity if you prefer. A metric specific for GANs is the Frechet inception distance, or FID. It is computationally expensive, using an inception v3 network's last layer to compare the means and covariances for the generator and discriminator. Lower FIDs are thought of as better. However, FID doesn't assure a good or useful image outcome. So, perceptual losses are used, including the perceptual path length introduced in StyleGAN. PPL represents the difference between consecutive images calculated through a VGG16 CNN from random inputs. Images with lower PPLs are more likely to be judged as high-quality real images by live people. Perceptual loss functions like the PPL have been cited in the peer-reviewed literature as useful for discriminating data generated by GANs. We've seen that a primary use case for GANs is the creation of synthetic data. This can be done when there is relatively little training data as a way to do semi-supervised learning, particularly if you have a large amount of unlabeled data that you can then go through and automatically label with your well-functioning classifier. Chang et al. Created synthetic whole-body pediatric MRIs. They found Frechet inception distance did not correlate with generated images. While DCGAN and StyleGAN-1 didn't fool any radiologists, StyleGAN-2 fake images fooled radiologists 30% of the time. An interesting use case is image normalization across the wide range of vendor equipment makes and models found in current use. This causes reproducibility problems in radiomics. Marketing et al. Used a CycleGAN to normalize these unseen components of imaging and improve radiomics reproducibility. As an aside, there is also the opinion that the processed images were more diagnostic than the unprocessed. Super resolution and denoising are both desirable for radiology. Super resolution because better resolution equals better diagnostics, and denoising due to the nature of ionizing radiation dose and signal-to-noise effects across modalities. By using an algorithm, potentially a GAN, to denoise, much lower doses of radiation or diagnostic radiopharmaceutical or even MR sequence acquisition time can be potentially achieved. We've already seen an example of modality transfer with CycleGAN. GAN-based segmentation and classification can be performed, but the latter isn't a primary function unless you have a need to use your already trained discriminator. Finally, Finlayson raised concerns about the possibility of malicious adversarial attacks on medical imaging data designed to produce a wrong output. GANs can actually be used to harden a classifier against such a malicious attack and possibly even focus it on desired features in a semantic manner. So I'm going to finish up here and remind you that if you're wondering if you can connect with me on Twitter, LinkedIn, GitHub, yes, you can.
Hello, my name is Ben Harvey, and I'm here to speak about who will get sued if AI screws up. I'm an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and a radiologist in the Department of Radiology at Massachusetts General Hospital, and also attorney licensed in Massachusetts. Relevant disclosures, none. So just a quick outline. So what we're going to talk about are kind of radiology AI applications and what happens when they fail. This is an area where there's a lot of complexity and there's not a lot of legal doctrine yet. And so there's not a whole lot of clarity, but I'll kind of bring forward what I can. What I will say is I've intentionally made the slides a little bit heavy in text. So if you don't want to hear me blab, you can feel very free to turn your volume off. And in reading the slides, you'll kind of get a sense of what I believe in this space. So where are we at right now? Well, it's interesting. Many of the cases, if an AI device fails and what are the kind of liability consequences, are going to depend upon the fact pattern. So if we're talking about, for instance, if it's a radiologist who's relying on AI in order to identify something, so essentially the radiologist and AI are working together to make an interpretation, then of course all three buckets, right? The radiologist has potential liability, the practice or health system has potential liability because of the radiologist, and the AI device manufacturer has potential liability. You can also think of a fact pattern, though, in some of the current AI devices that are really only used for triage and findings and happen before the radiologist ever sees the image. And that pattern, if that AI device fails, then it might only be the AI device manufacturer and potentially the practice or health system who's utilized that AI device that might be a target. But the truth is that whether we're talking about defense attorneys, whether we're talking about kind of plaintiffs' attorneys or risk managers, everybody's scratching their head a little bit right now as to what's the case moving forward. So I'm going to kind of deal with these three targets separately. So let's start with the radiologist target. So, as it was the case prior to the advent of any really radiology AI technologies, radiologists will continue to face medical professional liability under standard negligence principles, right? So how it's always been, if there's a radiologist malpractice lawsuit, the plaintiffs have to show a duty of care, the breach of that duty, and damages were sustained. And then also there's a causal relationship between the breach of that duty and the damages that were sustained. When it comes to AI, professional society standards and departmental protocols can play a major role in establishing a court's treatment of that duty of care and that breach of potential duty. And so when it comes to AI, I think it's very important that radiologists note that if you're integrating AI into your practice, you could protect yourself by having specific protocols in place and policies that help to guide how this AI should be used and how you balance the utilization of that AI against the utilization of radiologists and kind of balancing patient safety with radiology efficiency, because you can imagine that the case that would be brought forth against a radiologist or a practice, and we'll go to practice next, is that, you're using this AI to save time to make your workload easier. The radiologist has essentially given up the wheel, and because of that, a patient was harmed. And so essentially you can use policies and protocols to protect against that post facto accusation of you were just using the AI to save time without patient safety in mind. So first we talk about the radiologist target. Now I'm going to go back to radiologist target for one more minute, because what I want to say here is, if we treat CAD, breast CAD, like it's AI, right? It's essentially a similar type of device. It's not AI based, but it's a interpretive kind of device. CAD really didn't change radiologist liability. And I'm not really clear that there's really any breast radiologist who's been sued for missing a breast cancer on a mammogram who was able to say, well, CAD missed it. So, of course I missed it too, right? It was too hard to see. That just doesn't work. And I don't think it's going to work in the setting of AI. When we look at practice targets, so we know that health systems and radiology's practices can be targets of malpractice through this doctrine of respondent superior, which basically means the faults of your subordinates or employees can flow up the chain of agency and attach to those principles. Because of this, essentially, if there's a mistake that a radiologist makes in failing to identify a finding or misinterpreting something, and an AI technology has been involved in that, it still doesn't really change the milieu. The fact is, if that radiologist is found liable, then that liability can just naturally flow up to the practice. And often this kind of is is a vicarious liability, a strict liability that flows up. And it just kind of, it attaches. This is why you see both radiologists and practices have malpractice policies, because they're both targets. Now, when we're talking specifically about the AI setting, I do think there's something practices can do here. Again, one of the things that you want to protect against is possibly having somebody say, the reason that this was unsafe, essentially the practice was negligent in that they integrated AI that wasn't safe to integrate, or they integrated in a way that somehow compromised patient safety or reduced the kind of guardianship ability of the radiologist to protect against that technology that we know technology can fail. So this can all be done in policies and put into place beforehand. It just shows that practice or that health system is integrating AI in a very thoughtful way, and again can protect against those post facto accusations of negligence. And lastly, the AI developer. So if we're talking about the manufacturer of the AI, what liability do they have? As AI is increasingly integrated into clinical practice, everybody's saying it's going to be a product liability framework, right? So the same way, for instance, if you had a cardiac pacemaker that failed, the patient can sue that manufacturer. The same thing would be with AI. The only problem is that often the courts have generally not considered software as products. And so there may be some kind of hurdle to come over there to have a court kind of identify the software or the maker of that algorithm and that being the product, rather than, for instance, the CT manufacturer in which the algorithm is integrated into. Nonetheless, it's pretty clear that as AI technologies become increasingly embedded into these physical platforms and capable of causing body harm, there will be some negligence that attaches. What is left unknown is, what are the industry standards that will be called upon to determine if that technologically, if it was negligent, right? If that device was faulty. Our independent developers, like for instance, developers just out of university, subject to a different standard than a multinational tech conglomerate such as Google, who's putting out an AI piece. What if healthcare institutions modify those underlying programs or train those algorithms on new data sets? Do you somehow kind of wash away the liability from the initial manufacturer developer and bring it onto that healthcare institution? And all of these questions are questions that are up in the air. And so in a certain sense, AI technologies kind of prove victims of their own novelty, given that there's really a sparse body of case law to help understand any judicial precedent here. It's also interesting to note that, for many devices, there is this kind of strict liability standard and on-off. And so it might be easy enough to just look, the AI product said that it was going to detect cancer. Clearly, it missed the cancer. Strict liability. I don't have to show anything else. It essentially failed at what it promised. And so we just don't know to date how this is going to be treated. One thing that is important, where we do have very clear Supreme Court precedent, is that in Regal versus Medtronic in 2008, a 2008 opinion, basically the Supreme Court found that these common law tort claims or state-based tort claims challenging the safety or effectiveness of a device were preempted by federal law if that device went through the pre-market approval process. So this is the longer approval process that's used for clearing a medical device. However, this preemption or this protection by federal law doesn't apply to devices that went through a pre-market notification process or this 510K process. Here's the key thing. We know the 510K process is much cheaper to go through, and essentially all radiology AI devices today are going through this 510K process. So none of them are going to get this federal protection against kind of being pulled in to state-based personal injury type tort claims. And honestly, I don't think the extra cost of taking something through a PMA, I'm not sure it's worth it, because we just don't know how much liability is going to attach to AI products. So we don't know, really what you're saving and what the cost benefit ratio is there. So a quick summary of this kind of complex area. So in the short term, AI is unlikely to significantly change the liability environment, right? I don't think that radiologists are going to be able to push off liability if they miss something, saying, well, the AI missed it as well. This didn't work in the setting of CAD. I also don't think that in the short term we're going to see AI be so good that it significantly reduces the mistakes of a radiologist. However, in the long term, if AI is able to reduce the number of perception or interpretive errors, it could dramatically reduce liability in the radiology setting. And in doing so, dramatically increase kind of the safety and also enjoyment of radiology practice. However, we're likely still a ways out from this level of AI sophistication. The one thing that I think practices and radiologists can do in this setting is, if you're going to integrate AI, I don't think there's any reliability reason not to, but put some clear protocols and policies in place about how a radiologist should use this AI and how you've determined to put that AI into your clinical workflow in a safe way that's both safe for patients and keeps that radiologist backboard or guardianship in place. In all honesty, in the absence of any meaningful case law to date, a lot remains unknown. But I think that at this current point, a lot remains unknown, but likely everything also remains unchanged. So thank you so much for your attention. Again, a very complex thing to go through in just 12 minutes. And please email me with any questions you might have. I'm certainly happy to take them. Thank you.